I'm Nima Rajan, and this is Forum Daily Week in Review. A new study by the Canadian Federation of Independent Business says the average small business owner is working the equivalent of an 8-day work week. The CFIB report is based on a survey of members last September. It suggests that 59% of Canada's small and medium-sized businesses have been affected by labor shortages, which have led the average owner to work 54 hours per week to compensate. With us to unpack the survey and the impact of this labor shortage is Ms. Lorana Beaumal. She is an economist with the Canadian Federation of Independent Business and one of the authors of this study. Ms. Beaumal, welcome to Forum Daily.
Thank you for having me.
So as we mentioned and highlighted, small business owners were found to work the equivalent of an 8-day work week. Can you put that into perspective for us? What does an 8-day work week look like for these small business owners?
Yes, so on average, all business owners are working about 54 hours per week, and those that are affected by labor shortages to make up for it by working more hours are actually working even more, about 59 hours per week, which can translate to the equivalent of an 8-day work week.
And about 59% of small businesses surveyed were pointing to labor shortages as one of the main issues here. So what were found to be the causes behind this labor shortage?
So one of the main cause behind the labor shortages can be attributed to Canada's aging population. So we know Canada's demographic have changed in the past years, and the share of working age population has been declining, and the trend is set to continue.
And what does this labor shortage look like across our country? Are some regions harder hit than others?
So yes, provinces such as Quebec, Manitoba, and Saskatchewan are more affected, but we'll have to remind ourselves that even less affected regions or provinces are still quite high in shares of business that are affected. It's more than half of them in any provinces across Canada.
Some concerning information there. Now, in terms of the business sectors involved, are some business sectors more affected than others by this labor shortage?
Yes, by sector, at least 70% of businesses in construction, enterprise, and administrative management and hospitality sectors are affected.
You can only imagine the impact this could have on the personal and mental health of these small business owners. So, can you tell us a little bit more about the impact to them professionally and personally?
So this is a lot of time that business owners could spend on other priorities, of course, so such as growing their business or looking into government programs, developing strategies. But the impacts can also be on a personal level, as you mentioned. So many owners who work more hours don't have time for their family or their friends.
All right. So, what is maybe for more of a broader perspective, what is the expected impact of this labor shortage on the economy?
So we know another impact of labor shortages for small business owners, almost half of them mention it as the main impact, is that they have to turn down sales and contracts or decrease their service offerings. So it's already the case for most of them. So we can really expect some small businesses to lose some money here as they miss some business opportunities.
All right, Ms. Beaumal, let's talk about some solutions here. So, what kind of steps is the CFIB recommending to address this nationwide labor shortage?
So one solution could be to increase the labor pool of workers. So it can be with implementing measures targeting older workers or underrepresented groups, or simplify and improving the immigration processes. Just simply another set of solutions is to reduce red tape, and finally introducing more tax credits towards productivity, such as automation tax credits,
All
for
right.
example.
And what are you watching for next from policymakers when it comes to this labor shortage and as it continues to impact business owners across the country?
So we'll watch policymakers doing more, as it's really an important issue for our members and for small businesses across Canada and for their employees as well. They are working more hours too. So it's really a hot issue, and we look forward for policymakers to doing more.
Right, just about 30 seconds left here, Ms. Beaumal. But if you could leave us with one message from CFIB when it comes to this labor shortage and addressing the concerns of small business owners in Canada, what would it be?
I would say that business owners that are affected by labor shortages work 59 hours per week. That's a lot of hours that they put to work to make their business happen every day. So that's really the highlight of the report. So governments should really act right now to find solutions to help them.
All right, Ms. Beaumal, thank you again for your time today on Forum Daily.
Thank you.
All right, when we come back, we're going to be discussing the importance of early mental health treatment when it comes to the prevention of violence and crime. We'll have our interview with Mr. Jonathan Morris, an executive with the Canadian Mental Health Association, discussing what experts are saying about the correlation between violent crime and mental health. So stay tuned. Forum Daily Week in Review. We'll be right back after the break. Stay with us. Mental health experts are urging faster treatment for mental health and raising the alarm about the rise of violence across Canada. Amanda Butler, a BC criminologist and health researcher, says studies show that most acts of violence are not committed by people with mental illness. In fact, she says they are more likely to be victims of violence or self-harm. She says governments should rely more heavily on a poverty reduction solution, because if people have their basic needs met, their illness is less likely to worsen. Jonathan Morris is an executive with the Canadian Mental Health Association. He says the current emphasis is on people reaching a particular point in their illness before they get treatment. And he says recent violent incidents show that there is a clear need to treat mental illness early instead of waiting until a serious crime happens. Well, with us now to discuss the issue of mental health treatment in Canada is Mr. Jonathan Morris himself. Sir, welcome to Forum Daily.
Thanks so much. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, definitely. Now, as we mentioned, there's a lot of concern around this rise of random cases of violence happening in Canada. So what has your organization been seeing with regard to random violence and mental health?
Well, in our space provincially, we've been commenting and calling for the need to make sure that we don't blanket or assume that these recent tragic acts of violence that have been reporting in media get linked to mental illness without really truly understanding what's behind each individual incident. So that's been our perspective, is really encouraging recognition, similar to what understand what's behind each case before we make a claim that mental illness was the cause or the driver for each of these incidents.
And just to clarify for our viewers, this is CMHA British Columbia. So when you mentioned provincially, you're talking about British Columbia. Now, another thing you mentioned is the current system puts emphasis on people reaching a certain point before getting help. Can you tell us a little bit more about how the system operates like this?
Yes, and I think this is a situation that exists across this country. In that. In so many of the stories that we hear at the Canadian Mental Health Association are from people who have attempted to seek help or reach help, and they go through stages of illness where they gradually get worse and worse. And that particular challenge means that by the time that they are able to access care or access help, they are at a point in crisis. We are making strides, and in British Columbia, we're seeing those strides happen. We're seeing progress in some key areas like crisis response teams and a bigger emphasis on prevention and early intervention. But for far too many people across the country, the issue is that they're at a point of crisis before resources become available. And at that point, resources are very limited. Often it's the hospital or it's a police response.
And staying on the note of this being a national issue, how can our officials go about treating mental illness early as you recommend?
Well, at the national level, the Canadian Mental Health Association has launched a campaign over the past year called Act for Mental Health, and it really has been calling upon the federal government to make sure that mental health funding, mental health and substance use funding is invested in much more for transfer of more money into the provinces and territories to better fund care in the provinces and territories for mental health and addictions. That didn't happen with the last federal budget. But meanwhile, provinces, and I think BC is a notable example, it's investing significantly. It just invested $1 billion in the area of mental health and substance use. But it's to get funding at a national level on the same kind of footing as physical health care going forward. So that would make a huge difference for federal decision makers to boost that funding to the provinces and territories.
And how can these federal decision makers also avoid the risk of stigma if mental health and random violence are connected?
Well, it's a great question, and I've often been heard to say that words make worlds. We need to be very, very careful in how we describe violence and its causes and its roots. As you noted earlier, people living with mental illness are much more likely to be a victim of a crime themselves. Or to experience other kinds of incidents too. So we've got to be very careful in how we describe these incidents, whether it be a violent incident in community, and make sure we're not making that link. And decision makers, elected officials, people with platforms can set us back decades when it comes to stigma, or they can help push us forward. Because for the vast majority of people who live with mental illness, including myself, who never think about violence, having that kind of narrative can really have a chilling effect when it comes to seeking help, raising your hand, and it sets us back around people feeling safe to be okay, sharing that they have a problem and they need help and care.
Foreign Affairs Minister Melanie Joly says 100 Canadians have already left Sudan and another 1,700 have registered with the government and are being contacted by Canadian authorities. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau says the government is working to airlift Canadians out, and 2 military vessels are off the African country's coast as fighting shakes a new 3-day truce. Canada is continuing calls for a ceasefire, with hundreds killed and thousands injured. The violence erupted last week after power-sharing negotiations between the country's armed forces and paramilitary troops fell apart. Joining us now to give us an on-the-ground perspective of the situation in Sudan is Mr. Frederick Peary, who heads up the Executive Protection and Facility Security Programs at Active Crisis Consulting. He is a former counterterrorism special agent with the U.S. Department of State's Diplomatic Security Service, and he is actively involved in current evacuation missions in Sudan. Fred, welcome to Forum Daily.
Thank you, Nima. Thank you very much for having me on.
Now, before we dive in, Fred, can you tell us a little bit more about Active Crisis Consulting and how it's currently involved in evacuation efforts in Sudan?
Sure thing. You know, we're a small veteran-owned business, and we're in the business of supporting government agencies, military, and corporate clients with the global security solutions, doing emergency personal recovery, executive protection, special tactics training, and electronic warfare training. As I mentioned, we're veteran-owned. We're comprised with experts in their fields, mostly from diplomatic security service and special operations community, who have dedicated their lives to government and military service, and now use their lessons learned and tactics to provide security and stability to the private sector. My colleagues at Active Crisis Consulting and I are currently actively engaged in evacuation efforts in Sudan and several other volatile areas around the world. In Sudan, our teams have been working hard to establish an air evacuation route, and we have been tapped by several small organizations for advice and assistance with extracts and intelligence and imagery. Our team has been in contact with government entities and private companies, with American citizens and citizens from the UK in Khartoum and the Port of Sudan. We also coordinate with the Overseas Security Advisory Council, they call it OSAC, managed by Diplomatic Security Service under the Department of State. And we're closely coordinating with Moral Compass Federation, which is a federation of more than 20 coordinating non-governmental organizations that began working on evacuation efforts in Afghanistan and then to the Ukraine, and now coordinating evacuation efforts in the Sudan.
And I really want to touch on, I apologize for cutting in there, just about 2 minutes. I definitely want to touch on the recent developments in Khartoum. We've heard from the UN that a national health lab in Khartoum has been seized by one of these warring sides. There's concerns around a biohazard risk. There are polio, measles, and cholera isolates in this lab. What do we know so far about the developments around this?
Yeah, I saw that. They mentioned gunfire. Again, there's a ceasefire that was announced, but there's been reports of gunfire, explosions, and jets flying around. One of the bridges, the Shia Bridge and the Al Faya Bridge, are open and can be crossed through several checkpoints that the government, the Sudanese Armed Forces, and the Rapid Support Forces have open. You know, we're recommending people try to get out of those areas there. With the biochem hazard, that could be very detrimental down the line.
And meanwhile, as we highlighted, there are a lot of concerns around Canadians in Sudan. Does your organization have any updates on Canada's efforts to evacuate its citizens?
Yeah, for operational security, we can't get into the details of our movements, but at least 459 people have been killed and more than 4,000 people have been wounded. And there's close to 27 countries that have over 16,000 private citizens that are registered in Sudan, including Canada, the UK, France, and others. So I don't have specifics numbers on Canada, but everyone's kind of pulling together. The Western forces are trying to get out at this point.
And from your experience and expertise in addressing terrorism and conflicts, how do you see things progressing in Sudan, and what are you keeping your eyes on amid this conflict?
Well, that's tough. As I mentioned, the specific breakdowns of the American citizens and the Canadians, they're trying to get out. Saudi Arabia just has a Ministry of Defense ship in the port there that is allowing people to get on there. And from an evacuation point, whether you can get into Ethiopia or Djibouti or Eritrea, State Department's recommending try to get out of the country as fast as they can. The airport is closed, so the ports are one of the best ways to get out right now.
We'll definitely have to keep an eye on this developing situation. Again, Fred, thank you so much for joining us today on Forum Daily.
I appreciate it. Thank you very much for having me on.
A new study on melatonin gummies may help explain a recent spike in pediatric melatonin overdoses. The study, published Tuesday in the journal JAMA Network, shows the number of calls about pediatric melatonin ingestions to U.S. poison control centers jumped by 530% between 2012 and 2021. In the study, researchers sent 25 melatonin gummy products to an external lab. This was to test the levels of melatonin and other substances such as CBD. And researchers found that 88% of the gummies were inaccurately labeled. Most products exceeded the declared amount of melatonin on the bottle. Researchers also pointed to a similar study of 16 Canadian melatonin brands, which found that the dosage of melatonin was between 17% and 478% of the declared quantity on the bottle. Well, joining us now to give us more insight into this research in our weekly medical segment is Dr. Abhishek Raut, Medical Director at Appletree Medical Group. Dr. Raut, welcome back.
Great to be here, Nima.
Now, being honest, I'm no stranger to melatonin gummies, Dr. Raut, but looking at the study, how is it possible and legal for companies to mislabel melatonin quantities in their products?
How indeed is an excellent question. In the United States, we have the FDA that really regulates the supplements that are available. And in Canada, we have Health Canada. Now, both organizations provide regulations, licensing requirements, adverse drug reporting, and warnings to recall supplements. But a lot of this is, in fact, self-reported. And it's quite rare for us to see Health Canada or the FDA actively testing these supplements on a regular basis. So sometimes we do see these when they're actually tested. We find that the products don't have the supplements or have very little, or usually it's very little. So it's surprising here it's a lot of the contained supplement there.
Some very surprising information indeed. Now, getting really into this, what are the effects of higher doses of melatonin on the human body? And is it really a natural herbal supplement as it's often advertised?
Well, I mean, listen, first and foremost, melatonin is a hormone. It's a hormone that's made in the pineal gland in our brains and released into the bloodstream to help regulate our sleep cycles. As we get a bit older, we don't produce as much melatonin. So that's why supplementation, especially for older adults for shorter periods of time, tends to be very helpful for sleep. But melatonin supplements can be made from animals or microorganisms. And most of the time, they're actually synthetically made and marketed as a natural supplement.
And meanwhile, as we mentioned, there's been a notable spike in pediatric hospitalizations from melatonin gummies. Now, the majority of these cases were due to accidental consumption. But what are the effects of these products in children?
We see a lot of side effects for children: drowsiness, of course, headaches, agitation, increased bedwetting and urination in the evening. And also keep in mind, it is a hormone. So we see these hormonal issues for children as well, including puberty issues, menstrual cycle issues, and overproduction of hormone prolactin for women, which can cause breast and milk development as well.
All right, and another substance that was highlighted in this study was CBD, and there were higher levels of CBD than what was declared in these gummy products. So what do we know so far about CBD's ability to help people sleep and about safe doses of CBD?
Right. So anecdotally, we've seen, especially in adults, it has been helpful. It's difficult to regulate how much CBD and which strain, but certainly in adults, we've seen a little bit of an improvement in sleep when taken over short periods of time.
And are there any maybe alternative sleep aids that people can consider other than melatonin and CBD products?
Right. So there's a lot of evidence actually on magnesium to be used as a sleep aid. A lot of studies talk about the benefits of relaxation, sleep, but keep in mind, like any supplement, we're talking about side effects and adverse effects, and magnesium certainly has its own side effects, including diarrhea, and a deep sleep with diarrhea just doesn't sound pleasant.
Definitely, Dr. Rao. Just about a minute left here. But if a person were to choose melatonin as a sleep aid, are there certain brands with trusted doses to consider? And what is the optimal dose of melatonin to help with sleep?
Right. So excellent question. I think when anyone's considering melatonin, what you should look at is whether it's being tested. Now, in the United States, they have the United States Pharmacopoeia, the USP, which manufacturers themselves hire to test and verify products. So if you see that USP stamp on the label, you can be sure that at least it's been tested there. In terms of the optimal dosage, I mean, it's hard. The general rule for melatonin and likely most supplements really is you start off with the lowest possible dose to see if that works for you, and then that'll ensure that you have the lowest possible side effects and adverse effects while optimally improving your sleep.
All right, I'm Nima Rajan, and that'll do it for your look at important conversations from this past week. Remember, for more news on demand, you could always visit our website, thenewsforum.ca, and make sure to follow us on our social media handles for updates. We're available on Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter. You could also watch all of our news and commentary programming on the News Forum YouTube channel. All right, thanks again for joining us today on Forum Daily Week in Review, and we'll see you again next time. Have a great weekend, Canada.